Welcome to my channel, everyone. My name is Mark, and I would usually welcome you to my messy studio, but I'm not in my studio at the moment. I'm in Madrid, Spain. And since this city happens to be the home of one of the world's greatest art museums, the Prado, I thought this would be a great opportunity to talk about lessons I've learned from my many visits there. In this episode, part 2 of my Lessons from the Prado series, we're going to talk about only one painting by Velázquez, popularly called Las Lanzas, or the Lances. Last week, I sat in front of it for several hours, did a number of copies, and thought about what principles could be learned from it, principles which I'm going to share with you now. Let's get started. But before we start, I'd like to quickly tell you about my YouTube membership program. For a small monthly fee, members can access 2 long-form classes per month and other exclusive content. The channel has been up for only a few months now, but already has 12 full-length classes for you to enjoy. Okay, back to the tutorial. This huge painting, which is actually called The Surrender of Breda, depicts a Spanish victory over the Dutch during the 80 Years' War and is absolutely enormous, measuring 12 feet across by 10 feet high and featuring something like 30 figures. While the painting celebrates a single military triumph, the painting itself is an artistic triumph, a marvel of naturalism and pictorial organization that is nothing short of miraculous. We have much to learn from Velázquez in terms of rendering, but there's also much to learn from the way he composes. And though composition is a very large subject, in this video we're going to focus on only one aspect, which can be simmered down to this easily remembered slogan: always be massing. Composition is the art of putting together separate individual elements to create a whole. There are many ways of doing this, and if you'd like to see a simple overview of what I consider the basic rules of composition, I'll leave a link to that video below. At the heart of it, however, composition is simply a question of arranging shapes in such a way that it creates a feeling of unity. But what do you do when you need to put together a very complicated composition? Let's say a scene that depicts something like 30 soldiers on a battlefield. The answer is to group figures together into shapes and then arrange those shapes into a unified composition. Grouping elements in your composition has the added benefit of creating more interesting shapes, even if the individual components making up those shapes are not in themselves particularly interesting. So, for example, let's say I have a still life with a few very simple objects. One of those objects is a bottle. Another object is a bowl. Let's say we have a few different kinds of fruit, an apple and a pear, and a book. And maybe all these objects are placed on some kind of flat surface, a table. Right now, because all the objects are separate, the composition feels disunified. This is more of a study of individual objects than a still life. How do I create a more interesting composition out of this? By grouping the objects together into more complex shapes. So, for example, a better version of this composition might be something like this, where I have a grouping of the bottle and the bowl. So here's my bottle. And I'm going to group it together with the bowl. So the shapes are overlapping slightly, which together creates a more compelling, interesting shape. So we have a massing of these 2 objects. And then we can mass our other 3 objects together. So let's place this book a little bit more in the foreground, like so. And then we'll place the pear on top of the book. So we're massing the book and the pear together. And then maybe I'll place the apple towards the foreground. So I have a secondary shape that looks like this. So not only does this create more interesting shapes, because of the connections, it unifies the objects together, makes them feel more like they're part of a whole. And if I add some kind of table, let's say running through the composition like this, that's going to create a more unified composition. So this is an example of always be massing. As opposed to dealing with objects individually, group them together in a number of different ways to create more interesting shapes and to create a greater sense of unity in your composition. This is not just a question of overlap, but also relates to value. This is a tricky thing, but you can also render things in such a way that fuses them together. The difficulty being that you want to fuse them, but still make each object distinct enough so that you don't create confusion. This means blurring edges or keeping things close enough in value so that from a distance they blur into a single mass, but up close separate out. So, for example, if I take that bottle and put it in front of my bowl, like this. So here's my bowl. And then I start rendering. I might create a lost edge between the bottle and the shadow on the bowl that might look like this. That is very similar. The cast shadow created by the bottle over here might also be very similar. The shadow here might be similar. The cast shadow off the bowl, not sure exactly what that might look like, but so that from a distance things fuse into a single shape, but up close there's just enough distinction between the different shapes so you can see that there's a bottle in front of a bowl. Here is just one such grouping in Las Lanzas. The shadow values in this mass of figures are so close that it's sometimes difficult to make out whose limbs belong to who. However, had Velázquez rendered every figure as distinct and separate, it would create a very busy and disjointed effect. Velázquez is, of course, not the first artist to do this, and we see this principle applied in paintings by such artists as Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese, artists Velázquez was exposed to during his trips to Italy. Here is my diagram of how I think Velázquez divided up his figures. This is my opinion, of course, and other artists might have their own way of seeing these groups. This is an excellent exercise, however, and I would try it by either printing up the image and working over it, or better yet, doing a copy of it as I did. However you decide to group things together, it'll spur you to think about grouping things in your own compositional endeavors. Now let's see if I can apply this principle of always be massing to a landscape drawing. Here's the reference I'm going to use, and let's see if I can reduce down the complexity of this image by grouping things together and then grouping those groups into a cohesive composition. I have my image already penciled in, and I've made a number of alterations, one for the sake of the format. The photograph, the original reference, is slightly wider than my paper, so I've compressed the composition a little bit and eliminated some of the elements, and then I've tried as much as possible to mass things together. So where are my masses? Well, the first mass is this tree in the foreground combined with the bushes, so I have one continuous massing of objects here. Then I have a massing of objects in the middle ground, the fountain and this middle ground tree. That's going to be the second grouping. The third grouping might be the bushes and the cypress tree on the left side of the composition. I'm going to push it slightly past the rooftop just for the sake of depth and clarity. So if I show a clear overlap between the cypress and the building, it's going to push the cypress forward. So that's going to be my third grouping. The buildings in the background can be considered one single massing of shapes. That's going to be my fourth grouping, or maybe this and this wall could be two individual groups. But I've tried as much as possible to reduce the complexity of the image and to fuse shapes together, and hopefully that's going to result in a more cohesive, more unified composition. So let's go in with my line work and do a little bit more fusing together. So this is my foreground tree. I'm going to define some of the leaves with the line work. And then, as I said, I've done some eliminating here. So we have a second tree in the background towards the back of the building, which I've gotten rid of because it creates a really awkward overlap. Composition is almost always about some kind of simplification. And once again, I'm going to mass the shape of the tree and the bushes together. So here is our first massing of objects. Now let's work on the fountain. This is a complex architectural element. And I'm going to mask this fountain with this tree in the middle ground. So I'm fusing these two elements together. I'm still thinking about individual rendering, so making sure the overlaps are clear. So I'm not going to lose clarity for the sake of massing, but I am going to be thinking about these two objects, the fountain and this middle ground tree, together as one single compositional element. Then we have our third grouping. So we have the bushes here. And we're connecting them together with the cypress. That's grouping number 3. And then we have the building. Again, we've squished some things together. We've eliminated a few arches here because of the format, for the sake of simplicity. This composition is still going to be very complicated. It's not going to be the Siege of Breda, but there's a lot going on here. Lots of overlap between foreground, middle ground, and background. Lots of architectural elements. another archway here. What else? Oh, we forgot about this window. A few more details in the middle ground tree. All right, there is our line work. Now let's move on to the watercolor stage. And when we're doing the watercolor stage, we're still not forgetting about the always be massing principle. We're going to continue rendering in such a way where we're separating our 4, 5 different groupings from each other and then combining them together into a unified composition. Here is the complete watercolor sketch, which I hope demonstrates the principle of always be massing. This is a complicated concept to be sure, but I would start by composing a few simple still lifes using this way of thinking before working your way up to more complicated subject matter. Then perhaps one day you'll also be able to paint your own version of the surrender of Prado. Thanks so much for watching. Please consider becoming a member of my channel and see you next time. Bye for now.